Welcome back, Focus Learners. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating topic. We're going to look at how we can actually aim government intervention objectively without getting bogged down in all that subjective, messy politics. We're going to step entirely away from the shouting matches and look at pure, structured economic logic. And it's all anchored by a pretty revolutionary concept, the inclusive wealth criterion. So if we look at extensive cross-country data, a really fascinating pattern pops up. Structurally speaking, government spending actually acts as a brake on aggregate economic growth. It slows things down. Now, normally people hear that and immediately think, well, then we just need to minimize government at all costs, right? But what if we kind of flip that perspective? What if that braking force is actually a feature, not a bug? Think about it. If you have a powerful brake on your car, you don't just rip it out, you aim it deliberately. So the real question we should be asking isn't just how much government, but what exactly should we be aiming this brake at? Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with government as a selective brake, enter the inclusive wealth criterion, examine the role of consent, apply a 3-step brake test, see the criterion in action, and finally wrap up with taxing depletion, not production. All right, part 1, government as a selective brake. Let's set up the fundamental premise of why we desperately need a whole new way to measure and direct policy. Like we just mentioned, if the empirical data shows us that government slows economic activity down, we really shouldn't just blindly swing a machete at it. I mean, brakes are incredibly useful precisely because they slow things down. We just need to aim that braking force at the parts of the economy we actually want less of. Think about, say, a factory that's heavily polluting a river, or a fishing fleet that's just depleting a shared ocean, or even banks taking on massive systemic risks that the public is ultimately going to have to bail out. These activities grow rapidly because they dump their costs onto someone else. We want to slow those down. The problem right now is that most government spending isn't a targeted brake on pollution or risk. It's just this broad spending that indiscriminately slows down the entire economic engine instead of actually protecting our underlying wealth. Which brings us to part 2. Enter the inclusive wealth criterion. Let's look at what ultimately replaces traditional, easily gamed GDP metrics. Now, what's really interesting about this is how it changes the game. Traditional cost-benefit analysis, which relies heavily on GDP, can be gamed. You can inflate the numbers through resource depletion or forced transfers. But the inclusive wealth criterion, it asks a completely different question. It actually tallies up the present value of every productive resource in a country and weights it by what it's actually worth at the margin. That's its shadow price. And doing this is a total game changer because it replaces all that subjective political arguing with a strictly objective accounting ledger. And when we say every productive resource, we literally mean it. True wealth isn't just the produced capital that GDP loves to count, the factories, the roads, things like that. It's actually a combined holistic stock of 5 different things. You've got that produced capital, sure, but you also have natural capital, like clean air and resilient ecosystems. Then there's human capital, healthy, educated people. Knowledge capital, like scientific discoveries. And absolutely crucial is institutional capital. That's your rule of law and the trust within a society. Genuine economic growth only happens when this combined holistic stock is increasing. Because if you build $1 million factory, but you destroy $2 million of natural and human capital to do it, well, traditional GDP cheers, but inclusive wealth tells you that you're actually getting poorer. Moving right along to part 3, the role of consent. Now that we have our metric, we need a trigger. A foundational filter for when a government actually has objective standing to step in. So, when we map consent against inclusive wealth, a really clear objective rule emerges. 3 out of these 4 scenarios explicitly tell the government to do absolutely nothing. If wealth grows and everyone consents, great, leave it alone. If wealth shrinks, but the person consented, think of a competent adult choosing a risky, expensive hobby, again, leave them alone. The only objective trigger for government intervention is when inclusive wealth shrinks and the people bearing the cost never consented. That right there is where you apply the brake. Now, I want to be very clear about what we mean by a lack of consent here. We aren't talking about rhetorical complaining or someone just being upset that their preferred candidate lost an election. We are talking about structural consent failures. In economics, this is sometimes called a Coasian failure. Basically, it means third parties are structurally forced to bear the cost of an activity they couldn't possibly negotiate against. Think of downwind populations forced to breathe in pollutants, or taxpayers unknowingly backstopping wild systemic risks taken by a massive bank, or even just outright fraud against counterparties. When structural consent fails and overall inclusive wealth shrinks as a result, That is when the government has objective standing to hit the brake. All right, part 4, the 3-step brake test. Let's see how we convert this dense economic theory into a really simple, actionable algorithm. Let's move to this checklist and see how it builds a foolproof policy filter. Step 1. Is anyone affected who didn't consent? If the answer is no, you walk away. If yes, you move to step 2. Does inclusive wealth actually shrink for them? Again, if no, walk away. But if yes, you arrive at step 3. Does the cost of applying the brake actually exceed the damage itself? This includes things like deadweight loss, enforcement costs, and the very real risk of regulatory capture. Step 3 is a vital circuit breaker here, because let's face it, sometimes the cure really is worse than the disease. A well-intentioned government intervention might just get hijacked by corporate lobbyists, making everything worse. So you only apply the brake to protect our inclusive wealth if an activity fails all 3 steps. Next up, part 5, the criterion in action. Let's put on our detective hats for a second and try to solve a policy dilemma. And this brilliantly illustrates how the framework operates in the real world. Let's look at a coal subsidy. It shrinks natural capital through emissions, and it shrinks human capital via respiratory damage in downwind populations, people who definitely never consented. It also erodes institutional capital through the intense lobbying required to keep that subsidy alive in the first place. The net result is a massive loss of inclusive wealth for non-consenting parties. The verdict? Brake. Absolutely brake. Now contrast that with a basic science grant. That grows knowledge capital, which inherently spills over into the public domain. It grows human capital by training researchers, and taxpayers fund it through a constitutionally bounded representative process. Net inclusive wealth goes up across the board. Verdict? Don't brake. You see, you don't need a moral intuition or a specific political affiliation to score these scenarios. You just follow the capital. To put this into perspective and understand the sheer scale of why this matters, consider a striking finding from the authoritative Dasgupta review. Between 1992 and 2014, global per capita produced capital roughly doubled. It went up 100%, but per capita natural capital fell by roughly 40%. Do you see the problem? Traditional GDP hides the depletion of unconsented natural capital entirely under the guise of produced capital growth. It's essentially measuring one column of the ledger while pretending all the others don't even exist. The inclusive wealth criterion forces us to look at the whole ledger. Which brings us to our final section, part 6, tax depletion, not production. This represents a massive paradigm shift in how governments should actually fund themselves. So the crucial takeaway here is that this framework doesn't just tell us what to regulate. It actually tells us exactly what to tax. If government is a brake, well, we should aim that tax brake entirely at the bads that deplete our inclusive wealth. We should be taxing carbon, we should tax resource extraction when it goes beyond regeneration rates, and we should definitely tax unfunded liabilities. And on the flip side, we should immediately stop taxing the goods that actually create value. This framework tells us not to tax labor income, not to tax competitive corporate profits, and for sure not to tax productive investment. In fact, almost every major public finance economist has recommended some version of this base. Tax the bads, not the goods. Now, I want to quickly address a common question that usually comes up here, the Nordic paradox. People often point to countries like Sweden or Denmark and say, well, they have huge governments, but they are incredibly rich. It is so vital here to separate a stock from a flow. Wealth is a stock, growth is a flow. Those countries are incredibly wealthy today because they built up their massive stock of wealth over a century of relatively lean government and rapid growth, long before they expanded their welfare states. Today, their current growth rates, the flow, are actually quite low. They sit exactly where the empirical data predicts high-spending countries will sit, so the model holds up beautifully. I really want to leave you with this incredibly powerful heuristic. Don't tax production, tax depletion. It's so simple, right? Yet applying it would fundamentally rewire the global economy for the better. By using a highly targeted government brake on the things that actually deplete our inclusive wealth, we completely preserve and even liberate the overall engines of economic production and human flourishing. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought to ponder today. If we actually manage to stop taxing the engine of human ingenuity and strictly aim our government brake at the exhaust, meaning the unconsented depletion of our capital, how fast could our inclusive wealth truly grow? The potential is absolutely staggering. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, Focus Learners. Stay curious, keep looking at the data, and I'll see you next time.